we being recorded right now?
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I'll be careful with my word usage.
I have my drink right here as well.
I'm like almost out. What are you sipping on right now?
This is jasmine green tea of sorts.
I forgot that it's nighttime by you.
Exactly.
Yeah,
What about yourself?
I'm sipping on the Panther Ugandan Gorilla Summit. It's like a limited release, but I got it off trade. I was able to use the promotional code as a first-time user of this fantastic service trade coffee. I don't know if you've heard of it yet. But they have this thing called like All In It Together or something, and they're donating proceeds from certain select roasters have like one coffee that they're donating 100% of the proceeds to like local nonprofits. So Panther had one for the Miami restaurant worker aid group or something.
Okay.
And it was a good coffee. So I was able to both donate while paying a low cost as a first-time user of this new service, Trade Coffee. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, but they do have a 50% off promotional code for first-time users. And as a first-time user, I was able to use that code.
Wow.
My first time.
What's it called again? Trade?
Exactly. That's it. Yeah. Big fan of their service. You know, it would be a shame if someone ripped them off. But so I'm sipping on that, and because it's Panther, it comes like in a day. So
yes, the close proximity really helps. That's great.
Limit our carbon emissions in terms of flying stuff all over the world, right? Like,
dude, you wouldn't imagine like over here in Dubai. I've told you how booming the specialty coffee scene is in the UAE, in Dubai especially. They bring beans all the way from Germany, the UK, despite of there being like already like hundreds and thousands of roasteries in the country. Like they're bringing beans from the barn, like in Berlin, Nomad from Barcelona, and all that jazz. So I don't know why.
A lot. Yeah, I mean, I noticed it too in Amsterdam. There's a lot of imported coffee. Like we went to this place, it was called Scandinavian Embassy.
Okay.
And they only serve Scandinavian roasted coffee, which like the Netherlands are kind of like adjacent to Scandinavia, but still I was like, there's so many roasters in Amsterdam.
Right. But Europe,
I guess it's like a European.
Like so small, I guess. It's very, very.
Yeah, I mean, for them to import like a Scandinavian coffee would be like me shipping in something from like Arkansas or North Carolina or something. So I guess that. Yeah, the U.S. has a funny way of like looking at things. We're like, wow, like across Europe so far, and we're like, literally, our country is like triple the size of Europe.
I think let's jump into the discussion.
Of course.
Okay, so let's give people a bit of a background about our relationship. We go way back to the Billy Goat days.
Billy Goat days.
2017, I believe, when I texted you, a naive sophomore I was, looking for a job on campus specifically in coffee. I sent you a long text saying that I'm extremely passionate about coffee. And I just want to work as a barista at this little shed in the architecture school on campus. And I was blessed enough to get a positive reply from you, which I'm not surprised I got because of how great of a human being you are. But yeah, that's where our journey as friends began.
Yeah, I remember I think you talked to Avery, right? My co-manager at the time beforehand. Yeah. And she said something about this person. I remember specifically, she did not know if you were a man or a woman or gender non-binary. And it was like this person, Zarak, reached out. I think and like switched between she and he throughout the conversation. So when I first got your text, I was like, what's up, my person? My guy. And so, but I remember she was just like, "Oh, they came by and like are really into specialty coffee," and I was like,
Yeah,
"No, there's no one at into specialty coffee. Like, they
right.
must like Starbucks and be like, oh, I love a frappuccino." And so I was, but I was like, if there's anybody who expresses like a real interest in being a
Yeah.
barista, of course we're gonna have to follow through. And sure enough,
And
all those years down the road, became our champion barista.
please, no, I'm humbled. But yeah, dude, it's been 2.5 years. No, 3 years because it's 2020 now. Almost 3 years. So
Yeah.
holy shit!
Wow.
Wow, quite a
The
long
end of
time. I
2017.
mean, considering that it was college, but anyways,
Yeah.
uh, so there we began, and then it was the second semester. No, it was after a year that I was promoted to co-manager as well. So the two of us were co-managers, and um, that was another year with you and the Billy Goat, and it was wonderful. It was probably one of the best decisions I made in college, honestly. And then, yeah, and then, okay, so that's a bit of background about us, I guess. That's where your whole shenanigans with coffee began. Feel,
Wow.
feel free to go back to the
Yeah. The
letter.
early day. I don't. My mom's like an avid coffee drinker. Like, I'd say addict to a degree. When we have fast days in Judaism, she has to, and when you can't drink, right, similar to Ramadan, she has to wean herself off. She starts cutting her coffee with decaf like weeks before to prepare herself. So, yeah, I grew up with a mother suffering from coffee addiction, so I was always exposed. And also, New Orleans is like, um, top coffee city, I'd say, in the U.S. I know Portland and Seattle might take offense to this, but like Folger's main roasting operation is in New Orleans. We're like a main port for most of the coffee, right, from Central, South, Caribbean, America coming up. We're a huge port for that. So I was exposed at a young age. I remember like always wanting the froth off the latte when I was really young, and right. And so I never really liked like just black coffee, like regular coffee, until um, it was probably, this goes back to a show called Dangerous Grounds with Todd Carmichael, right? The owner of La Colombe, great roastery based out of Philadelphia. On Travel Channel, this show, Dangerous Grounds. And so he'd go around the world finding rare and unfound coffees before in dangerous areas. Like there was a bit of a Hollywood effect to it where he'd be like running from gunmen shooting at him. Like, he put himself in these adventurous scenarios, but it was at that point actually learning of the path that coffee takes to get to you that I became so interested in it, actually. And so that's like when I first started wanting to drink coffee myself in a real way. And so I started by buying the coffee that I'd see in the show, and then trying to prepare it at home. I did a lot of research at first. I was like, oh, espresso is the only way to make it. So I bought like a $500 espresso machine, like my Hanukkah and birthday present combined when I was like 13 years old, maybe 14 or something.
Which one was it?
It was a Breville, early Breville, very similar to the Gaggia Classic we used,
Okay.
very basic.
Okay.
But it had a dual boiler. It was a nice one. I got it really cheap. It was like a $2,000 espresso machine I got for maybe 300, 400 on Craigslist, right? I'm like going on Craigslist as a young kid. But I used to make the coffee that would be in the show if it was on sale at La Colombe, and I'd watch it and I'd taste it, albeit in a crappy espresso, with like steam milk on top, like whatever I was doing back then. I have pictures, honestly, of early coffee. I gotta see if I can pull those up. I don't want to take too much time, but I guess if you're editing this out. But I used to put in like this like flute, like almost champagne looking glass jar. This is an early picture of like this is when I was first figuring out what latte art was, like how it worked, right? And
What's
then
going on over there?
this is so I'd watch the show. You can see I was watching the show here, and I had my my coffee in this strange container,
Oh wow.
drinking it through.
Love
Albeit at like late at night too. Like this is 9:48. I remember I used to like not be able to sleep at all because the show would come on at 9. And so I'd be like, gotta drink the coffee. And my mom's like, you're not gonna sleep. And I'm like, yes, I will. Yes, I will. And so, but I bring this up to say it was significant because what got me into coffee was the journey it took to get to me. Not just like, caffeine juice, which is I think how a lot of people get into it. So I think that's significant tracking back to how I first started getting involved, seeing the people who grow it, how it's processed, the lengths that both importers, exporters, like every cup of coffee you drink has likely passed through 100 hands before it's gotten to you. And I don't know any other product, food product in the world like that. Because it's such a unique crop and that it's grown in places. The primary drinkers of coffee, the nations that drink the most coffee, are the nations that can't grow coffee, which is really, right, kind of mind-boggling. It became popular first in Europe, right? The coffee houses. Enlightenment grew out of coffee houses in Europe.
Although, okay, yeah. Wasn't it simultaneously consumed quite a lot in Yemen and in the Arabian Peninsula as well, I think?
Yes, I don't mean to have a coffee history erasure, right? Coffee starts in Ethiopia.
Right.
That's where it first grew. Then it came to Yemen because they're very close on the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So yes, it started out, when you track the history of coffee, it goes Ethiopia to Yemen, Yemen to Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia to Turkey.
Right.
Turkey is how it got introduced to Europe
right.
through, the Ottoman Empire, through Italy and, Germany, eventually got to the UK. I did a whole project in high school going back to that too about, this was like my final paper for European history, I think, tracking the Enlightenment movement and thought to coffee. How before people would get together and drink beer at a beer garden, right? That was like the social drink of choice. It was also, water wasn't clean and beer would clean it out. But it would keep you tired, right? Beer intoxicates. So coffee kept you up. And so people would think and talk. And so coffee houses in London and, Berlin and Amsterdam, all over what we think of the Enlightenment capitals, came out of people having something that doesn't intoxicate them. And so so many, I think Henry VII, I don't know which Henry, a king of England, tried to outlaw coffee when it became.
There was quite a few attempts in Italy as well, I believe, in the early 1400s. I think the Pope, it was declared a satanic drink by much of the priests and the ministry at the time, the Catholic Church, because they believed that it would cause an uprising, or it would some sort of like, it would bring about satanic thoughts. But when the Pope tasted it, he made it legal and not prohibited anymore. And in the 1600s, it was considered haram in Mecca as well, which was quite interesting. And then again later on, but anyways, that's pretty weird to see that it was just completely outlawed in some areas.
Right, because getting people up and going, it causes you to think once you're moving more and your brain's moving faster, and that can lead to rebellions, especially when systems aren't equitable to begin with.
Absolutely.
Even from its outset, right? The first myth, the story of how coffee came to be, was this goat herder in the Kaffa region saw his goats eating it. This is the part I didn't know. So I saw he found a goat eating it, this coffee bean. He got very animated. The guy thought maybe I should eat it. He started sucking on just the raw cherry, felt a little something because there is some raw caffeine if you actually have the fruit. But it wasn't until he brought it to a local monastery, right? Because Ethiopia has a long history of Christianity there. And they said, oh, this is no good. Whatever is happening here, we need to get rid of it. They threw it in a large fire, which by accident they roasted the coffee.
Oh, wow.
One of the monks from the monastery was like, oh, what's this in the fire? Let me try it. I guess he ground it up and put it in water somehow.
Yeah.
And that's how roasted coffee came to me. Because you always think about how, right, it's like this raw plant, right? It's a tiny cherry on a tree. How did someone get the idea if I roast the seed?
Exactly. And then ground it up as well.
Exactly. So that, who knows how it actually happened? That's the legacy of how coffee started in Ethiopia. But so it is funny that religion has this back and forth where they're like, this is no good, this foments rebellion.
Yeah.
And then they try it and they're like, oh, right. And even in the Ottoman Empire, I know that you did find like Sufi
monasteries
who would take it as like a root of elevation, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. It was consumed, especially during the month of Ramadan, to stay up during the night for prayers and recitation of the Quran. So it would keep them up, and they wouldn't require as much sleep, of course. But yeah, it's quite
exactly.
It intermingles and then gets outcast, and then again comes back in.
And so it's got a huge cultural impact, right? That's the big thing. It's like, and it's a spread cultural impact, right? So I was saying earlier that the people who drink the most coffee tend to not be from coffee producing regions. So the cultural impact, and that's not always the case, right? Ethiopia has a long coffee culture. Colombia, all sorts of countries that produce coffee still have a coffee culture.
Yeah.
But just the levels of consumption statistically aren't as high as Europe and the US. And that's why it's called an orphan crop, right? Because it's grown one place, processed there usually, and then shipped off for its final form, its roasting form, in a third country. And that's also because the coffee bean stores very well, right? Green coffee can keep up to a year fine.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay.
So that's another reason as a crop, it doesn't spoil. If I had lettuce, I can't grow lettuce in Ethiopia and send it to the US. It's going to get nasty. So it's a tropical fruit, right? Also, tropical fruits tend to spoil really quickly as well, right? Mangoes, you don't see shipped from India usually. It's got to be close by. So coffee is a rare tropical fruit crop that can store really well, which is why you see it as an orphan crop, because it has to go through these levels of processing, and then the last level of processing at origin to the processing at destination, it stores really well between there, so you can see it. But this is all great and dandy. The issue is that historically, with colonialism, the global north takes advantage of the global south. And so coffee is just the perfect tool to do that. If you're a colonialist thinking, how do I, make money off of people in tropical areas, that's one way to do it. So as an orphan crop, I just think of chocolate and coffee as very similar as orphan crops in that way, because the money being made, the bulk majority of the profit is not being made by the producers, which is crazy to think about. I don't know any other product, period, where the money is mostly being made by someone else who's doing less work, which is not to call out coffee roasters. They still do a great job, but and they still have to make profit, and the standard of living in the areas where they're roasting is going to be higher, right? So you have to charge more. But it's insane to think that a pound of Arabica coffee, the commodity price is about $1. It was dropped below $1, I know, recently. Okay. But then you're buying it for a pound even. You're talking $20 and up, even for not specialty coffee.
Absolutely.
So that's, where that $19, that's a 20 times markup. And it just isn't. There's not enough work that's being done to justify that 20 time markup. Absolutely. So the question is, we have systems of power, right? And we can either decide to band-aid them and, pay the farmers a little more, but still have all the markup, or you can try to actually break down the system and then reconstruct it from the outset. And so that's what I was really interested in is, fair trade, direct trade, all of those, B Corp, all of these different certifications are Band-Aids, and they're effective Band-Aids. I'd rather, if I have a cut, put a Band-Aid on it than let it keep bleeding.
Right.
But at the same time, I'd want to get it stitched up and actually healed.
Right.
And a Band-Aid won't do that. So the question is, how do you reorient the industry to have the people who are working the hardest and taking the most risk, number one, because planting a crop of any kind is high risk. Number two, how do you make sure that they have a quality of living that they deserve for this? And then how do you redistribute the power balance, the wealth balance here? And so that's what coffee, I feel certain guilt, I guess you could say, almost, in drinking it. You know, I always try to have direct trade, fair trade coffee, but at the very least, showing gratitude, and then not just showing gratitude, but trying to fix what's going on,
Right.
is so necessary in the coffee world, I think.
It
feels better. Yeah. Sorry, what?
No, I'm so sorry. I feel like in terms of doing action, like taking actions or steps towards a better or more equitable relationship between, let's say, the roaster and the producer. I mean, I feel like you've taken some like tangible steps yourself with the uh, Dominica Revitalization project. My bad.
Mm-hmm.
So
It's a mouthful, right? I always imagine having to fill out bank paperwork, and they're like, "Okay, what's the name of your nonprofit?" And I'm like, "You got a pen and paper?"
Yeah, it must be a challenge, dude. But yeah, I feel like you're doing some good stuff with that. So like maybe go into that a little bit and give a bit of background on the work you're doing there.
For sure, yeah. I can go on for hours. Yeah, it's the Dominica Coffee Revitalization Initiative, the DCRI. It describes what we're doing very aptly, but it's a mouthful. So the DCRI is how I'll call it from now on.
Perfect. Sure.
Right, and that was started again in 2017, similar time to when you were meeting me, probably around the same time. September of 2017 was really when it took root, and that was after Hurricane Maria in Dominica. So prior to all of this, I had this idea of using coffee, right? Just what we talked about before. How do we redistribute wealth? How do we design systems of power and wealth across the world? So I always had this idea of using coffee as that. There's a lot of great examples of how that's been used in the past. Different co-ops in Ethiopia have been pretty successful. The coffee I'm drinking is called Gorilla Summit Coffee from Uganda. They've used it as community development because they have a perfect area. In the past 20 years, they've just started really focusing on quality and export, and that's been helping. So it's been done before. So I had this idea originally. It was Fiji, because I have connections in Fiji.
Right.
It seemed like a decent place to grow coffee. Drier, wasn't perfect. But it wasn't until Hurricane Maria hit Dominica in 2017, September 17th, 2017, when I was watching what was going on there and the massive destruction. I mean, you know, I think if people even remember Hurricane Maria now with all the craziness that's happened in the past 4 years, it's Puerto Rico and the U.S.'s failure to address the issues going on there. But Dominica got hit by a Category 5 hurricane. It was strongest at that time. And just even the way it hit the island, it was like a freak storm. You know, you're getting a Category 5, one of the strongest storms ever recorded in human history. A Cape Verde hurricane, which means that it had time to go all the way across the Atlantic and build up steam. And then this is the island of Dominica, right? And it went like this. It took it in and went across the island. So it literally was like the worst thing you could conceive a hurricane doing was exactly what happened. And then from a social perspective, they had it, every hurricane forecast had it as a Cat 3 at most. It went through rapid intensification in the 24 hours before it hit. And so the people weren't prepared either for it, yet alone the natural consequences. So the scenes afterward, I think 95% of structures were destroyed. which is unseen. I don't know any other natural disaster that can do that. Almost 100% of the agricultural landscape, forests, reserves were just wiped to the ground. I mean, like, Dominica was known as the nature island of the Caribbean, still is, because of its massive forest reserves.
Right.
I can go into the history of that, but we don't want to do that here. Essentially, they've been able to protect their forests better than any other place in the Caribbean, which is great because it also has very rare species and it's a unique natural place. So, but when you talk about the destruction, you have trees like the Gommier tree. It can grow up to 100, 150 feet. The base is like 20 feet wide sometimes, like massive trees, just toothpicks in the wind, just knocked right over. And new buttresses, like they've got like the crazy roots that dig into the ground. Like it's not an easy tree to topple, but in the mountains too, right? Elevation, sheer wind coming through on precipices, you're talking, people have surmised that winds probably gusted up to 300 miles an hour, right? Which is like jet power, like a jet forcing at you. People I talked to who were in the mountains then said that they were actually lifted up, that it was like they couldn't stand. They were just taken away. So that's a crazy thing to think about. And then they had no assistance from the outside, right? Immediately beforehand, Irma hit Antigua and Barbuda and Martinique and Guadeloupe, and then Hurricane Maria after hit Dominica, 2 days after hit Puerto Rico. So U.S. is dealing with Puerto Rico, England's dealing with Antigua and Guyana, all sorts of their colonies that are left there. And then France is dealing with Guadeloupe and Martinique. So you're talking about the major players who usually come in to help weren't there. They were dealing with their own stuff, didn't really care about an independent small island nation that most people don't know about. So Dominica was kind of left in the lurch. And so I was really affected by what was going on there in the immediate aftermath. I'd been through Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Right. So I felt it a bit more viscerally, I guess, just because I knew what that was like to take a once in a lifetime, hopefully, storm and rebuild after. So my first response was like, okay, I'm going to donate money to relief efforts. I'm going to donate clothes, food, whatever I can do. But I also then thought back to Katrina and living through it, what worked and what didn't. And what I realized what didn't work was just people giving us clothes and food, because that runs out quickly. What you need is how to get back on your feet. It's like this, give a man a fish he eats for a day, teach a man a fish he eats for his life.
Absolutely.
So I was just trying to figure out how to do that. Coffee was not in the question there.
Oh, really?
But, right, it wasn't my original thought. I was like, how can I help out in the most effective way? Originally, I was coordinating with a seed distributor. It was like some Christian pilot organization. They were flying tiny Cessnas into Dominica and dropping tons of seeds, different seeds that they could get, just to get things growing again, because everything was just flattened. And I think that's what made me think, okay, seeds going to Dominica, they need to rebuild their agricultural sector. Over 50% of the population was employed by agriculture. Historically, that's been their strongest asset. They don't have the white sand beaches of other islands in the Caribbean for tourism. So I thought, okay, seeds, agriculture, we're working with something here. Then I started thinking, okay, the island's very tall. It's a very high elevation island. That's good for coffee. Jamaica's done it in the Blue Mountains. Why can't Dominica do it? And so I started researching coffee in Dominica, and there's very little literature that's been written on it. But you start finding stuff from the 1800s, right, the early 19th century, that Dominica was once the largest producer of coffee in the world, in the British Empire. Number 2 in the British Empire, actually, in the 1850s, next to Jamaica. So, and it was called Dominica Bonifiere. It was French and English island. It was a coffee they used to roast with other coffees to make coffee taste, like blends taste better.
Right.
Right. So I was like, right? So they have this history of coffee production, quality coffee production.
Right.
What happened? Um, and the answer to that was like tenfold. Most obvious is they had the coffee borer beetle. They had this blight, the coffee blight of 1851, I want to say, which wiped out a lot of coffee fields. Apparently, later research I did, you could have just burned part of it and it would come back.
Okay.
But people shifted to sugar because they wanted to make immediate profit.
Okay.
So they tried to take out their coffee fields, plant sugar.
Right.
Simultaneously, abolition is happening in the British Empire then. So at one time, a majority of Dominica's enslaved labor force worked in coffee. But they're becoming emancipated, I guess. There's a slow process to that. So it was like this perfect storm to take out coffee production on the island. So the question is, how do you look at history? How do you look at the failures and build something back up while keeping in mind the historical context, right? I'm well aware that coffee, right, 60% of the enslaved population in Dominica at one time worked in the coffee plantation. So it's like, you don't want to associate this product with slavery, right? This is, especially with a white guy coming in and saying, let's grow coffee. That is the furthest thing that I want to do, right? We're talking about redistributing and rebuilding systems, not building them back up from the ground. So, there's a cultural asset to that too. So I thought, okay, the easiest way, the best way to approach this is to have local partners that share my vision, want to do this. I quickly got in touch with a local nonprofit leader, Michael Saverin, who runs the Canton Village Development Corporation there. We got together. He said, this is a great idea. My grandfather grew coffee. Where did it go? He's this guy, Michael Saverin. He's still my co-founder, co-director. He is very into this sustainable tourism, agriculture, whatever, be building a more sustainable island. So he was immediately on board. And so through him, we started getting in contact with government officials, trying to work from the ground up. And there was enough support, enough interest for me to realize that this was worthwhile. Albeit I did face a lot of naysayers, people saying, coffee is gone for a reason. So we had to address why it's gone. Yeah. And that didn't, we really worked until my first trip there on I guess June, maybe, after the hurricane. So it was still like a half a year after the hurricane, but things were fresh. Tourists hadn't returned yet. You could see the impact immediately. Everything just, forests were just decimated. People were struggling. And so I went with my friend Alex Muska, right, filmmaker, because we wanted to shoot a documentary simultaneously. We got to document what's going on here. And from there, the first thing we did was just go right to where on the maps, I saw the elevation looked good. There was roads going there. Satellite imagery looked like there's some farms. So I just went there and I thought, if there's going to be coffee, this is where it's going to be. And that area is called Syndicate. It's on the slopes of Mondiabloten, which is the tallest mountain on the island. So we went there, and the first thing I noticed is there was coffee. Abandoned fields, but coffee nonetheless.
Still growing.
Still growing, and it wasn't knocked over, which was like, hope right there. It was actually fruiting, albeit not taken care of, not managed properly because it was abandoned. But that's when I was like, okay, coffee can withstand crazy winds, right?
Interesting.
There were very few crops.
Is it because it's a very narrow, small, short crop?
Exactly, yeah. Very deep root structure. That's one thing of coffee, is that taproots can go down like 6 or 7 feet. So sometimes the coffee plant can actually be taller on its bottom, like the iceberg, than on its top.
Interesting.
Helps it stay in the ground better. Shorter tree, right? The more I don't know what you call it. The larger the structure, the greater the likelihood of taking it down. The fact that wind can blow through the leaves, right? It's not a very dense structure. It's like a branching plant.
Right.
Lots of reasons. So it survived better. And the farmers I talked to, they did lose a lot of their crops still, because any 200, 300 mile an hour winds are going to do that to you.
Absolutely.
But coffee did the best out of any crop, except for root crops. That's the only other thing that did.
Okay.
So I also went to the farmers and I was like, what do you do with your coffee? You got to figure out what they're growing coffee still, but it's not the most major crop that they're growing, first of all. Second of all, they didn't know where to sell it. That's another thing, right? It's a small island. They didn't have the economy of scale there. So, like a Colombia, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, you have mills because everybody's growing coffee. You have enough quantity to export.
Absolutely.
And all farmers have to worry about is growing and bringing. So when I talk to the farmers, a lot of them are processing it themselves at like a home mill. Old ones. Some of them were like, 200-year-old mills that I saw.
I remember from the documentary you made, the short documentary, the little pulping machine. It looked very rusted and just beaten up over time. It didn't look very much like modern technology, but it was still, nothing wrong with that.
Right, and that's what in the doc he says, with modern technology, and he's showing his rusted machine. But that's it. That's like the most modern technology they have available, right? This was installed in the 80s. I found out the government made a push to bring back coffee in the 80s.
Oh, wow, okay.
Which is what the coffee I saw was from that government initiative to diversify their food crops.
Okay.
So the reason why coffee never really came back was that it was affected by this, and then other crops took over. Dominica as an island, because we're talking about economies of scale, they kind of have to like choose one crop to focus on in order to export at an amount that is worth their time. So I said sugarcane came after coffee. Immediately after sugarcane, you had limes. After limes got a disease, because also you got to think about crops get diseases when they're monoculture, which is like when you're only planting one crop, you increase your risk of disease.
Right, absolutely.
And risk investment. We talk about diversifying our assets. If you're not diversifying, then you have a lot to lose there. So limes came, then citrus, other oranges, grapefruits came as the dominant, and then the real, they call it green gold, was bananas. They had a exclusive agreement with the UK to have preferred prices for their bananas because they're a former colony.
Okay.
So farmers started growing bananas everywhere, which bananas aren't great for the environment. They take a lot out of the soil. One tree can only produce once ever. So it wasn't a great sustainable move on that part. So the government realized that in the 80s, because they lost their agreement with the UK once the EU came to be. And they were like, we got to find. So coffee was one of the things they turned to, but you saw the government would just provide people plants and say like, good job, keep going. But you have to have a full-scale infrastructure, right? We talked about all the different hands that touch coffee, right? Just to go through it briefly, what happens with the coffee process is you have to grow a plant. It takes 2 to 3 years at least before it produces coffee. The coffee is a cherry, right? With a skin on the outside, fruit on the inside, like a pulp on the inside, parchment around that, and then you get to the seed.
Right.
So you have to take off the skin first, then you have to wash it or dry it with the pulp on it.
Right.
It has to be dried either way, fully dried. Then it has to have the parchment taken off, and then it's green coffee, and then you can export it for roasting. So the processing takes a lot of time, effort, money. So they didn't provide that infrastructure, right? We're talking about mills. You need a mill to just take off the skin at its origin, and that just wasn't available widespread. Farmers would have it individually. They used to have public mills, but they weren't upkept. And of course the hurricane took those out. So farmers, when I originally came, they said, I grow coffee, I'm interested. I sell it to like hucksters. They sell it to people who come from other islands who purchase it and then either sell it on their island or process it or do whatever.
Okay.
And so they were not getting a lot of money for it. They said, my grandfather, my father grew coffee. I know it's important, but it's not worth my time and money. But they also said, this is the one plant I have still there after the hurricane. So that's when I realized there's interest in growing coffee. There's a history in growing coffee. But what we need is infrastructure and reason to sell, a buyer.
Right.
So that's where we came in. We decided we're going to use as innovative processes as we could to grow coffee, right? We're talking about long-term sustainability. So just giving someone the plant as a donation, very sweet. But again, you're going to run into the same issues that they ran into in the 80s when the government gave them the plants and they just sat there, didn't have anyone to sell to. So what we needed to do is build the infrastructure. We need to have mills that everybody can use, either free or low cost. We need to have buyers. We need to have who will give them a good price. We need to have export set up already, lines of exporting to the US, EU, Asia, already set in place so that they know that they're going to get paid. And then at the growing process, we need to actually make sure that what they're growing is going to stand the test of time, whether that be hurricanes, climate change, droughts, floods, earthquakes even. I mean, Dominica is it's a volcanic island. It's getting earthquakes a lot, possible volcanic eruptions. It's a very unique place. And because it's volcanic, it's great for growing anything, especially coffee. So it's your strongest asset is also your strongest risk, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So we thought, how do we address that? And so one way is hybrid coffee varieties. That's what varietals, whatever you want to call it. That's just come in the past 5-10 years, the research done on that, which is, we talked about getting the disease earlier. Coffee is very prone to various diseases, especially when monocropped all together. That's how diseases start out. Think of coronavirus. Coffee goes through the same thing. If it's too close together and not social distancing and there's no buffer, then it's going to spread the disease really easily.
Absolutely.
So we look at disease-resistant varieties. Then you also want to make sure that they're quality enough that they can sell for a specialty price. Then you also want to make sure that they produce at a high enough quantity that doing that. So what they do is really crazy. World Coffee Research is kind of at the forefront of this. They take really resistant, strong varieties, whether they be Robusta, which is actually a different species, in the same family, same genus as coffee, Arabica, or you take really hardy already hybridized Cottonmore type that is shown to be disease resistant. Then you crossbreed it with high quality, high producing varieties. So they actually went to the origin of coffee, the heirloom varieties in Ethiopia that you can find in the forest there growing naturally. It's already there. So they crossed all of these things together through really crazy genetic splicing all the way to, you talk about genetically modified crop. This is a genetically modified crop, but with the idea that you're bringing it back to its actually what it used to be, to the original. It's you're genetically modifying it, not for high yield so you can spray pesticides and herbicides they do with Monsanto, which is terrible. Very genetically modifying to actually get back to what it was and make it as strong as it can to address disease, climate change, all sorts of issues.
Right.
So we looked into the hybrid varieties from World Coffee Research, what would grow best. That's where we started. Then the second and probably most important facet of this is the agroforestry concept. One thing that you notice when you go to the farms after the hurricane there was that the ones that had forest around their plot of land, right? Most plots are kind of a square, so they call it a windbreak, right? And so they have big trees like gommier and all sorts of different rainforest crop trees growing on the periphery.
Right.
Those field farms by far survive the best because the winds would get blocked by one thing, and then the farm on the inside, it's like building a wall around your farm.
Right.
Nature.
Okay.
So that's easy now. A lot of farmers cut down their windbreak that used to be there historically, so that they could plant it because they wanted to make the most money. They used the windbreak trees for timber. But after the hurricane, that was the easiest thing to tell people is you got to have a windbreak. Look at your neighbor's farm who still had his windbreak. He's doing just fine. Your farm's decimated without the windbreak. Keep that windbreak. And people are attuned to that now. That's the first step of agroforestry, is providing wind and flood protection with other trees. Then the second step is diversifying your assets, right? Just like investments, you need to diversify the crops that you're growing. So you can use the same idea of windbreak, preventing soil erosion, right? The more roots you have, the more dense the soil is, the less moisture that can sit in it, the less flooding you have, because the roots will take up a lot of the water. So then we think, what plants work well? What else can you grow around it, right? There's, for most farmers, I'd say, across the world, they at least grow something next to their coffee to provide shade, because coffee is an understory shade crop, which is how it naturally grows best, is underneath the forest. Highest quality, but unfortunately, open sun coffee, full sun coffee has become popular because it'll produce at higher rates then, especially if you pump fertilizer into it and irrigate and do all these unnatural processes. It'll give you more quantity, but the quality drops because it doesn't want to do that. So, it's like taking steroids or like some drug before you play. Like, yeah, you might perform at a higher quality, at a better rate, but it's not good in the long term. So a lot of coffee is grown under shade. A lot of farmers put some sort of shade system there, whether that be...
I have another question. I've always heard this, or I never kind of went deeper into it or looked it up, but people would say like, oh, if coffee is growing next to a farm of oranges or some other fruit, it's going to somehow, those flavor characteristics will become part of the coffee crop growing. I don't know. I never verified this, but I always heard this from some people. But
I'm a bit skeptical of that. I think
it sounded too good to be true. It's like,
it's a great idea, but think about, does that happen with other fruits? Do other fruits take on the taste of other? If they're close enough relatives, you can have that happen, right? You can have hybridization and cross-pollination. Like, that's a thing that happens.
Okay.
That's how we get new varieties, is by different similar fruits crossbreeding.
But yeah, I think somebody sold me beans or something, and they're like, oh, this grew next to mangoes, and you can taste a little bit of mango sweet characteristics in there. I don't know what that was. But
that's what we call thinking, I think. The only thing I could possibly think of is coffee needs to be pollinated as a flower, right? The bees have to get into it and pollinate it. That's a complex system of like pollen and then the stamens, so it has to like somehow they have to be pollinated. It's much easier for coffee than other plants to be pollinated. Essentially, you just need a bee to kind of touch it with its fuzzy butt and it'll go all over.
Right.
So maybe you could make a claim that if your mangoes are flowering at the same time your coffee is, that the bee goes between the two, or whatever, pollinator, moth, whatever. And somehow, I don't know about all that, but
it was a very ignorant question. I'm sorry. I just
No, it's not ignorant, because I thought of it too. I thought like somehow the roots talk to each other. Right, that was my original thought. I was like, yeah, like this is, and from a biological perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But from a qualitative perspective, you're like, yeah, it'll work. Like, and roots do talk to each other. That's a thing. They have microbial interactions, right? So that's not crazy to think. But there's not, I don't know a lot of research. I think the greatest input for coffee flavor is number one, roasting. However, who roasts it, however quality they roast it at, is going to take out the flavors. Number two is the altitude, I think, has a big thing to do with it. It's just the conditions it's grown in, and shade,
Right.
especially
Right.
shade.
Right. Exactly.
So that's the thing. It's like shade coffee is going to produce a less quantity, but almost always a higher quality because it's
Right.
happy. You want your plant to be as in happy conditions as it can. It needs to have quality shade. It needs to not be too hot or too cold. Coffee is very finicky. It grows between, I know for our international audience, I should use Celsius, but
Yes,
maybe you can
please.
translate. 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 80 degrees Fahrenheit is its ideal temperatures, and it
Okay.
wants the fluctuations especially.
Interesting.
It wants
Okay.
it to get hot during the day and then down to cold at night. That's so it maintains its sugars into its cherry. So
Okay.
citrus does the same thing. That's why you want like a cooler winter for citrus, is
Um,
because it has to dedicate more, how do you say, more sucrose into
okay.
its fruit, fructose into its fruit to allow it to survive.
Gotcha.
So all of that's really important for the coffee production. So you want
Right.
to have it in as ideal conditions as possible.
Okay.
Agroforestry is a great way to do that because now coffee also doesn't want wet roots. It doesn't want its feet in water, but it also wants to be wet. It's like coffee's so finicky, and that the way that it wants to have good drainage, but also wants to have good rain. Very complex
Yeah.
crop. So agroforestry helps because it provides more moisture
Right.
to sit in the ground so it doesn't dry out because you have shade and you have a cooler temperature because of the shade. You have root uptake, which means it's never going to flood too much if you have other trees around.
Right.
The soil isn't going to erode, so its roots will still be kept underneath. You've got all of these things disease-wise, less chance of disease when you have a diversity of crops in between. And then the other thing is the crops that you grow as agroforestry, as tree crops, you can also sell. So you talk about putting them next to mangoes, citrus, bananas. Those are
Right.
really popular
Okay.
because they're easy to sell on the market, right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
when my coffee isn't fruiting, I can take my mango and sell it. If my coffee isn't fruiting, my avocado, whatever it is, I can sell at a different time. And a good idea too is to think about when each crop fruits, because then you have year-round profit.
Right.
Even wood, timber is a big thing, right? If we're planting big trees, we want to make sure we can, at one point, 30 years later, sell the tree.
Okay.
So it's all this, and the timber can serve as kind of like a savings account, right? If worst case scenario, you can cut the timber and sell it. If you really need money, then not a good idea.
Yeah.
For environmental reasons, all the things we talked about, you want to keep the trees there.
Of course.
So that's like the basic idea of agroforestry is diversify your assets, help the environment, right? You're providing habitat for birds, pollinators. We talked about bees pollinating.
It's
you
a
want to
cycle.
make sure that
Right.
coffee naturally grows in a forest setting. Why would you take it out of the forest if that's what it wants? So you keep it in that, you keep habitat, you have carbon sink, right? You're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, all these benefits, multifold agroforestry.
Right.
What I've been working on recently with agroforestry is not only using the trees for all the benefits we talked about earlier, but to actually increase the fertility of the soil, right? Farmers have been using different leguminous trees is the word, legume, like, peas are a legume, right?
Okay.
Most things in pods in the Fabaceae family. So some of them have what we call a rhizobial nitrogen fixing interaction, where they take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. These tiny little rhizobia, microbacteria, microbiota in the soil. The roots of these plants then create a symbiotic interaction with these bacteria, these microorganisms, and they take nitrogen out of the air, they fix it into the soil, and then it increases the fertility of the soil. Coffee needs the macronutrients of any crop is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Right? Did I get that right? Yes, I think so. You have micronutrients too, sulfur, magnesium, zinc, iron, all the other things that are in soil, but the big NPK, nitrogen is the most important. That's leaf
Okay.
growth comes from nitrogen. So I've been working on how do we use nitrogen fixing trees to provide both shade,
Ooh,
habitat, alternative sources of income through the crop and the wood, and
right.
then also help the soil. So we have this
Brilliant.
is where I get really hyped, is that when I was on the farms the first time,
Yeah.
one of the farmers in the documentary, Clement, pointed at this big tree. And he said, this is a pois doux. We always plant it next to the coffee. I don't know why. My grandfather did it. My father did it. I do it. So he just said it's a good shade crop. And I realized, yeah, it's a good shade crop. Anything that provides shade is good.
Right. Right.
Um, then I start doing some research into like really old, I was talking about the 18th, 19th century
Right.
writings about this. This guy mentions the pois doux tree, which I had in my head as the Purdue tree.
Oh,
There's
okay.
the accents and the difference.
I understand.
Pois doux, right, is Creole. It's Dominican Creole, Haitian Creole, French, whatever it is. Pois means pea,
Okay.
and doux means sweet. So
Oh,
sweet
okay.
pea, which
Interesting.
is called ice cream bean, also known as Inga edulis, the Inga family of tree, which is a fruit-producing leguminous tree that fixes nitrogen to the ground,
Right.
produces these pods of like peas, but around it is this pulp that's like cotton candy-ish texture and tastes like ice cream.
Okay.
Really cool stuff. There's
Yeah.
now a market for that internationally because
Oh,
people
no
want
way.
to rare tropical fruit.
Uh-huh.
So now you're looking at history. This writing said every good farmer had a pois doux tree next to their farm.
Yeah,
This
okay.
guy is saying, yeah, we plant the pois doux tree next to our coffee. I don't know why.
Right.
Now you're looking at research coming out of the Amazon, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia that's saying Inga edulis, this pois doux tree, fixes nitrogen because it has that rhizobia
Right.
interaction.
Right.
Things are kind of firing off at every level,
Right.
right?
Right. That's
So it's like, not only do you make profit from the coffee, better coffee now because of better soil, better shade, better moisture control. Not only are you making profit off of the fruit crop that you're doing and you're bringing back historical, cultural shifts, but you're also creating a better environment. You're reforesting because
absolutely
Inga vera, Inga dominicensis are all native trees to Dominica. So
interesting.
you're helping the environment, you're helping the economy, you're helping the culture, you're helping the soil. Everything is being
Tenfold. Yeah.
uplifted. So, and that, you have a positive feedback loop usually is a bad thing in environmental science, where
Okay.
it's like, this idea of one thing leads to another until you spiral out of control, right? Climate change is warming the oceans. The oceans store CO2. So when it heats up, CO2 gets released into the atmosphere, which furthers climate change, which releases more CO2. And eventually you've got this unraveling cycle that is why we're so screwed. So one way to do that is to have a positive feedback loop for a good thing, right? Which is to counter it. So we're planting trees, which is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. We're increasing soil fertility, decreasing soil erosion.
Right.
It's like this, and that's going to just make things better and better. And eventually you're getting back to your original forest system that you had, while adding the benefit of growing coffee underneath, which you can sell for a high price.
Okay.
So all of that's to say that that's like the basis of what we're trying to do here, is using historical examples, bringing history, the past to the present, all the good things that they did in the past,
Right.
with like the pois doux and what these farmers remember their parents doing.
Right.
Because agroforestry has been a thing in Dominica since the indigenous people, the Kalinago, did it. And then you're bringing the future to the present with these hybrid varieties that are disease, climate change resistant, sustainable, and you're putting them all in one with the end goal of trying to, create a real sustainable coffee industry on the island. That, the dream is to have it comparable to Kona coffee, Blue Mountain coffee. It's rare. It's a small island. Not many people have heard of it. It's got this unique exotic factor to it. We have history that shows that Dominica has been able to produce high quality coffee, and the climatic factors, the soil, the rainfall, the temperatures, the way that even the clouds come down on the
Ah,
island,
right.
all are things that mimic different microclimates in top producing regions, whether that be Kona, Blue Mountain in Jamaica,
Yeah.
Yirgacheffe in Ethiopia. So
Mhm.
whereas the one piece we're missing is the elevation.
Uh-huh.
Yirgacheffe in Ethiopia, you're talking like 2,000 meters above sea level. In Dominica, the highest you'll be able to produce at is 700 meters above sea
Oh,
level.
no
So
way. Oh, shoot.
big shift.
It is, yeah.
But Dominica has microclimates. Since it's an island, it has a very unique climatic factor. So the island, the tallest point is like 2,000 meters above sea level, maybe.
Okay.
So similar to Ethiopia.
Mhm.
But you could never grow coffee there because it's too cold, it's too wet.
No
The
way.
microclimate mimics like a top alpine. It's crazy. They call it the elfin woodland. I've never been there because you have to hike really high up to get there.
Okay.
But it's so wet and cold and rainy there
No
on a
way.
tropical island, right?
That's cool.
That
Yeah.
it's impossible to grow coffee. So
Wow.
Kona is the same thing. Kona coffee is rarely above 700 meters.
No way.
Uh,
Yeah. Wow.
Blue Mountain is usually higher. It's usually up
Yeah.
to like 1,000 meters, but still,
Yeah.
islands have a really unique microclimates and systems that allow for you to grow, to mimic different climates at lower elevations.
Right.
So,
That's amazing.
yeah, so we hope that this will work to our advantage and we'll be able to have like a,
Inshallah, it will. Inshallah. Yeah.
inshallah, yes.
Yeah.
We got to put everything into play first. You know, we have to
Yeah.
be very persistent and detail oriented with this because you're talking about putting a lot of money, people's time, effort, land into this
Absolutely.
project.
Mhm.
You can't F it up. So
Absolutely. No, there's a lot of stakeholders involved, I'm sure, like a lot of people
exactly.
that go into it. I don't want to keep you any longer right now. I know you have to rush. I'm just
You're all
gonna
good.
I'm just gonna throw like two questions that I really wanted to go over with you. Um, I think this is more related to Pakistan that I'm coming at you with this question. So, how would you say that, let's say like there's specialty coffee that somebody really wants to bring into a culture that has not been, not, yeah, that hasn't seen anything as like third wave coffee in, as you would see in the West or even in Indonesia where specialty coffee is kind of becoming a big thing, and no one's been exposed to that. So how do you see a way of translating that into a place like Pakistan and making it something that people can grab onto? Like, because there's this ongoing thing that I think about, how sometimes people don't give a shit about where the coffee's coming from, or like nobody wants to have that conversation. Like, fine, they want coffee, they want good coffee, but that, like, sometimes that's the least of their kind of concerns when it comes to like, oh, this is a typical varietal that was grown at 1800, naturally processed honey, etc., etc.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. People are, especially in a poor area, you have to have money to care, essentially. Like, why do I care what the coffee producer is getting paid and all of the economy of it if I'm not getting paid enough to afford it, right?
Right.
It's
But
like you
also
need
like,
money to care.
yeah, and also like in, it's not that people in Pakistan don't have money. We have a very big, like this kind of, okay, this, the coffee shop going culture is mostly in the middle class, upper middle class, elite bubble of sorts.
Yeah.
That these are the people who frequent these places. So even they, I don't think, would have any sort of concern in going all the way back to the roots of how it's grown, where it's grown, which is, I think, the kind of, that's like what draws people into specialty or third wave coffee, is that this is a transparent process that we're showing you, and you're completely connected to, you know, the farm, it's traceable, you know, the grower and everything, you know, everything that's been done to it, and here it is in your hands, and you can sip on it and it tastes great.
Mm-hmm.
How would you translate something like that to a culture that is more so tea drinking and, yeah, hasn't been exposed to this third wave or specialty culture, I guess?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing is exactly going to the Dominica project. You have to work in the ecosystem of what it is. You can't tell people what to feel. You have to let people come to their own decisions about what they want and make those decisions themselves. So sometimes it's not possible. Not to. I think it is possible, especially with coffee. We've seen people say it's impossible, but in some scenarios, it's
Right.
if you are a culture that's so dedicated to tea and people don't drink coffee at all, yeah, you can introduce it, but you can't shift culture as easily. It's
Yeah.
really difficult. I mean, with social media, modern media, it's much easier to shift culture than ever before. But culture takes time to build. Culture takes time to develop. So that's like the first thing to think
Right.
about.
Yeah.
But the U.S., it's been done before. You're talking about middle and upper class people starting to get interested in specialty coffee, and from when I first was interested to now, the shifts are insane. Just looking at New Orleans, for example, where I grew up and started, getting involved in specialty coffee. When I first got interested, so 7, 8 years ago, there was 1 or 2 specialty coffee places in New Orleans, like where you could find out where the farm was coming from.
Right.
I'd say now there's maybe 50 or so cafes, right? So like you're seeing a massive explosion of it on the scene.
Right.
And so when I first started applying to work at these places that were springing up, I remember this conversation with this guy, Jonathan, who runs Mammoth Espresso in New Orleans, which is like really to the art form tailored to your experience, right? Like they weigh every shot type deal. They'll throw it out if it's not up to the specifications. Small batch, high price, focus on, it's called Mammoth because it's like a big deal on a tiny thing,
Okay.
He does it with tea too. And he told me about the dollar threshold. The cup of coffee, whether it costs more than $1, is a huge ceiling to break through. And once you can break through, the customer, now you're not talking as much about culture, you're talking about customer acceptance. And so if the customer base is willing to pay more than $1 for a cup of coffee, that's like the big, threshold that you need to break through.
Right.
Become more disseminated in that way. So you need, I mean, taste is only going to go so far, and in terms of, getting people into it. Tasting something can change someone, like Maeve, my girlfriend's dad. He tasted specialty coffee, bought him a machine for a nice like automatic pour over machine for Christmas. We've got him nice beans, and now he's like, I want to get into it. So that's one way is to have people taste the difference. Another way is to keep costs down as low as possible while still having transparent ways. There's a place in New Orleans, Coffee Science, that keeps it low because they're in a low income community.
Okay.
So it's not difficult. It's not easy though. It's a difficult process. But if people have dispensable income, if they have, what would you call it? You're the economist here. Income that they're willing to spend that they don't need to. Disposable income.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you. That's the biggest thing you need is disposable income first. Second of all, you need to have it look cool, have it be something that people are interested in. And with transparency, you also need a philanthropical culture. You need a culture of philanthropy where people are used to spending more for doing the right thing.
Right.
China is a great example of that. They've gone through this shift in the past 10 years where now they have disposable income. A lot of people, they want to do the right thing with their money.
Right.
And specialty coffee's blown up in China because of that. So those are, I think, the biggest things that you need to be there. And then you just have to trudge along. Like, it's going to take time, right? The first specialty coffee place is never going to find immediate success. It takes that's why as a cafe, it's contrary to what you think you'd want to. You think I want to be the only one, but in reality, you need to build a wave. You need a critical mass of people pushing something forward, and then it becomes more normalized and widespread.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think as far as cafes go, there's a lot in Karachi, at least. It's not like all the big cities like Islamabad, Lahore. Even some of the small cities have quite a lot of cafes that have popped up. and cafe culture is there, coffee culture is there. It just has not come to this point yet where there's more curiosity in terms of what is it that I'm actually consuming? Where is it coming from? What is it that makes it taste like this? And how can I make it better? It's mostly just I'll have an iced caramel latte, more caramel, please, because I don't want bitter tasting coffee. And I think that's like there's a natural progression. It's not that there's a right or wrong, obviously, but I think even some cities in America, I'm sure, are not exposed fully to a third wave culture, and
Yeah,
it's
you're talking about the second wave right there, where it's
right,
widely available. People are drinking coffee and going to cafes and drinking it, but they
right,
haven't yet gotten on to like caring about the raw product, where it comes from and how it
yes,
is.
absolutely. But yeah, I thank you for the input on that. I definitely agree with you. I think there needs to be more players, and I think right now at this point there's like 4 or 5 that I see, um, and inshallah I shall try to you know get
Get
into
on the
that as
wave.
well. Hopefully, let's see.
You
Uh,
just need one success, one, big people are seeing it,
yeah,
and it's the way. You need to trail.
I'm getting you into that as well. I'm gonna fly you up just so.
I'm
just
I'm there in a heartbeat. You know that. As soon as I can fly, as soon as I
my
can.
God, my God.
I was hoping to be in Karachi right now,
Oh
actually,
my God, yeah.
but
It's
things change with
ridiculous.
pandemics, and instead we're talking through a screen. But hopefully, it's temporary.
Yeah, inshallah, absolutely. Only temporary. But okay, thank you so much, dude. I think I'm gonna let you go.
Of
I feel
course,
pretty bad for keeping you over.
no worries. No worries. I love talking about it. Yeah, I did have Maeve lord over me. I was just ignoring her for a second. So
Yeah, that's right. Are you
I
going?
think that was the sign that it was ready to go. But I'm so happy we got a chance to
Dude,
chat.
pleasure. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Uh,
Anytime I'm there.
I'll link all the relevant links down below with the revitalization project link as well and your lovely documentary. So yeah, thank you so
Beautiful.
much. Have a
All
wonderful
right.
day.
Well, we will talk soon. It was so nice talking to you, like always.
Thank you
Be
so much.
safe out there.